speak to us from Nuclear New York. Here at the computer is Eric Dawson. He's been a web designer for professionals and small businesses for over 10 years. Susan, it does work better when I hold it away from my phone.
Yeah.
His interest in using innovative technology to address environmental issues has led him to invest in venture capital funds focused on resource efficiency. In addition, he's become involved in multiple grassroots groups in New York City focused on finding bipartisan solutions to various social problems. And Camilla is in Bodnaruk. You got closer then? Yeah. You wouldn't know about him. Ethan is a licensed professional engineer in New York with experience in water, wastewater, and stormwater engineering, including civil and stormwater design for solar installations less than 10 megawatts. He has master's degrees in both nuclear engineering and civil engineering, having previously worked in nuclear non-proliferation with the U.S. National Nuclear Security Agency. As a volunteer for Citizens Climate Lobby in Nuclear New York, he is an advocate for effective and economically beneficial climate policies that promote good jobs and the conservation of natural resources. I give you Nuclear New York. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's really good to be here. Kind of funny, I was expecting to learn more about solar and the local community by now as part of the presentation, but we're going off strong with nuclear beginning. Can't hear me?
Could you either get rid of the mic and really talk loud?
Okay. Is better for me to get rid of the mic and project?
Yes.
Okay.
I like that.
Okay, good. All right. So I was just saying, yeah, I'm really happy to be here. We met in Albany a couple weeks ago at the Climate Council at their hearings, and we were there with James Hansen on the left in this picture, world-renowned climate scientist, and also worked together with the New York Energy and Climate Advocates. We made a lot of connections with labor unions, and we're happy to meet folks from Glen and get this invitation here. So it's kind of funny, it's starting off so much nuclear. I was expecting to learn more about the local area first, but we'll get to that next. So thank you for having us. So first of all, we're focusing on how nuclear power needs to fit into the overall equation for New York and the country for making this energy transition, and to do so in a way that protects the climate and our land and nature. So starting off, what is nuclear power? We find that folks can be very curious about this topic. So,
hey folks, if you think we can't hear your voices, it all adds up. So if everybody could just either go outside and talk or appreciate it. Thank you.
So nuclear power is based on a process, nuclear fission, where atom of uranium is split apart by a neutron that hits it. And so when it splits into two smaller units, there's a slight loss of mass in there that's converted to energy with Einstein's E = mc² equation. So when these uranium atoms split, energy is released. And the energy is used to heat steam, and the steam is used to run turbines that produce electricity. So that's just, it's very similar to other forms of energy production. So much of it involves steam, running turbines to make electricity. So one of the really unique and beneficial features of uranium itself as a fuel, and why it helps so much in a low carbon energy system, is that it has this dense, extremely dense energy that leads to a dense bundle of benefits. So 1 pound of uranium itself is equivalent in energy to 3 million pounds of coal. So it's a crazy difference. On that last slide with the atom, most of an atom's energy is locked up in that nucleus. So when you split it, you get way more energy than you do from chemical reactions on the electrons involved in the atom. So go ahead and go back. So uranium fuel comes in little pellets, and that fuel, when it's fresh, is safe to hold in your hand. And so 1 pellet itself is equal to a ton of coal, 150 gallons of oil, etc. So it's something the size of just a gummy bear has all this. And so what's really unique about uranium is that it's both a fuel source and it's, in a sense, a form of energy storage. You have so much energy locked in that, that's the reason why some of these other benefits I'm getting to, they're so good. So first of all, life cycle greenhouse emissions. So all energy sources, the power plant has to be built. That takes material, concrete, construction equipment, things like that. So even taking all that into consideration, energy sources have, over the whole life of a power plant of any type, or a field of solar arrays, you know how much greenhouse gas emissions you get per unit of energy. So nuclear is the lowest. Of course, it's hugely less than your fossil fuels, and it's roughly equivalent to some of our renewables, but even better than them. And so that's because there's so much energy in uranium that even when you build a nuclear power plant and you run it for 48 years, all of your emissions are up front in building the plant, and it's zero after that. Also, because uranium is so energy dense, you use a lot less materials overall per unit of energy in getting nuclear energy. So, so you can just see here, there's the different building types: cement, glass, concrete, steel. Nuclear needs a lot of concrete for the containment of the fuel, and steel in the structure, but it's much less than geothermal, winds, hydro. You have to have huge dams for impound water and solar power. And so kind of going in line with that, the overall land use for nuclear power is lower than other energy sources, even including mining. These bar graphs include all the associated land impacts, including mining of fuels or extraction of fuels if it's fossil fuels. And so just something a little more visual. This is a slide that was produced for a new nuclear reactor being built in Great Britain. And so one nuclear reactor that's there sited on 430 acres that powers 6 million homes all of itself. And the approximate equivalent in energy production, you need 130,000 acres of solar panels for that, or 250,000 acres of wind turbines. And just one thing to add to that, there's never been pressure with a nuclear power plant to build it on the smallest possible tract of land or anything like that. So those numbers could even decrease potentially. And so the last presentation, it touched on some issues overall with grid reliability and capacity factor. I want to make sure to kind of define some of these concepts and just drive them home a little bit more. So the capacity factor is just the percentage of time that an energy source is producing, right? Can you bring up the graph? So these colors respond to nuclear, hydro, solar, and wind. So nuclear, because it's a fuel, we can control how we use the fuel and when we want to produce energy. They run 95% of the time. So this little gap here is that little gap of time that they don't run for refueling. This is particular to New York State. So solar, as mentioned before, only has a 14% capacity factor. So overall average throughout the whole year, you're only getting power from it 14% of the time, and all the rest of this 86% of the time, you're not. And so our challenge, we take it for granted sometimes how complex our energy grid is. When we turn on lights and everyone gets home and starts all their appliances and everything, power plants are kicking on to meet that demand. We have a system that needs to provide all the power right when we want it, and some people think we can provide that on-demand power with energy sources that aren't on demand, and That's not realistic, and that's not affordable. And even if we were to try to do that, you would have to overbuild. You'd have to build so much extra solar and wind that when it's only a little bit sunny or a little bit windy, you can still meet all that demand. So that's why costs go up, and even with batteries, you can only store so much. You can't keep storing energy forever in batteries. They have the limit that you build, and you can't build an infinite amount of them because that's expensive. So really what we're trying to say with the grid reliability is, we know how to do this. We know that these baseload sources, the on-demand energy sources, where we can control when we produce the energy, that's what we really need. And so we have examples, and we need solar and we need wind on top of it. Those help. We need all our low carbon energy sources, but we have to be realistic about how we produce it and the demand that we need to meet. So across the world, there's only a handful of examples of countries or here provinces in Canada that have done that. And you can see hydro is blue, nuclear is orange. So, and then the fossil fuels are green. So all the countries that just have a tiny sliver of fossil fuels, it's either they're blessed with huge hydro resources, or some hydro and a lot of nuclear, or a lot of nuclear, like France, right? And so this isn't something new or that we don't understand. There's countries that have been way ahead on this for a long time, and that's how it's done. So, when we talk about nuclear power, there's our media attention. It's easy to bring up fear about it, right? It can feel scary when we read and hear things about nuclear power. But when you look at the facts, a lot of different research and sources have tabulated how many people have died attributable to different energy sources for energy produced. And so nuclear is very, very low on there, really on the same order and range as renewables. So, there's only been 3 accidents in the history of commercial power in the world. And at 2 of those 3, there weren't any deaths attributable to it. There was some release of radiation to the atmosphere, but people weren't right there, they weren't eating it, they weren't exposed to it at high levels that caused deaths. And Chernobyl was the only one where there were some deaths. 56 directly attributable, there's some estimates that are a little bit higher than that. But then there's explosions of fossil fuels all the time, there's air pollution and fossil fuels that are killing people all the time. So people don't always appreciate that nuclear power is already safe. And I'll talk more about how advanced reactors are becoming even safer. And so, with that, James Hansen, the climate scientist we mentioned, he does a lot of direct research on the actual science of the climate and weather patterns and things. But he's also, a very strong advocate for nuclear, and he's done the peer-reviewed research saying, well, let's look at the benefits of nuclear for the decades and decades it's been running. And that nuclear power would, if it wasn't there, fossil fuels would have been providing the energy, right? And if fossil fuels have been producing all the power that nuclear power produced, there would be air pollution and people would be dying from that. And so, using very conservative numbers, they estimated that almost 2 million deaths have been prevented just from existing nuclear power. And projecting this ahead decades, that number will be at least 7 million deaths prevented. And that'll only go up if we rely on nuclear power more. So there are some questions here about waste. So nuclear waste, it's a really unique type of waste because unlike a lot of the other waste that is produced from electronics, from fossil fuel combustion, it's so highly regulated that it's trapped. It's contained in a small volume and there's a lot of attention on how it's handled and treated. And so it's tracked well, it's not ending up in landfills like a lot of other toxic wastes and metals we have, and it's very easy to store and shield. It just takes concrete to block the radiation from it and release the heat that it gives off, and that heat it gives off increases over time. So it's very easy to store and shield this waste and to keep an eye on it. And so disposal, in its solid form of these pellets, means it's not getting dispersed in our air like pollution from fossil fuels. It's not ending up in our water like materials like dumps, things like that. And really disposal is a political, not a technical problem. We know how to do this. Finland actually just opened a deep geological repository. Canada is getting close to it. And the U.S. is trying to take a more like people-centric approach to finding a community that will host one. So and in the meantime, nuclear waste is safe on site at facilities. So not only is nuclear power safe, but nuclear waste itself has never caused, in the commercial nuclear power industry, caused any deaths or injuries. We know how to handle it very well. And in addition, so this is waste from my nuclear power plant over decades. It's all right there, just sitting safely in these concrete casks. And so next generation reactor designs will reuse the waste and use uranium even more efficiently, so there'll be less waste. So just briefly touching on the cost of nuclear power. So there are multiple studies from U.S. organizations, different scientific researchers, the International Panel on Climate Change itself, and they show that decarbonized electricity systems, when we're getting to low carbon energy grids, the costs are significantly lower with nuclear than without. And that's because you're avoiding all the overbuilding of solar and wind, all the extra transmission, and other factors like that. And in the meantime, also, ensuring that existing reactors remain online is actually the most cost-effective climate action. So the subsidies that need to go to nuclear reactors that are struggling because of low natural gas prices, if you just do the math on how much carbon those nuclear power plants are avoiding, it's way cheaper to give them the small subsidies they need than to build solar and wind and other new infrastructure. And so, people sometimes are stuck, in the 1960s or 70s thinking about nuclear power plants then. So nuclear power plants have been evolving, they've been getting safer and improving all this time. So this generation 2 nuclear plants are existing ones. Generation 3 are already being built in India, China, we have one in Georgia, in the US that's being built. And even more advanced reactors, small modular reactors and generation 4 reactors are in development. The first sodium fast reactor is being built in Wyoming at the site of the old coal plant that's shutting down, and that will be operational in 2028. So the new reactors that are coming out, they're modular, which means many of the components are built in a factory and shipped to a site. So there's much less construction going on in the field. There's much more control and cost savings over the construction. And so they're really being designed to be able to build them more quickly, more efficiently, lower capital costs. Because that is nuclear's struggle with the initial capital costs, but once they're built, they're just pumping out energy and selling it. And so new reactors have passive safety systems where intrinsically the fuel, as it gets hotter, it gets less reactive, so there's no chance of a meltdown. We have passive safety systems where gravity and the natural flow of air is enough to cool the plant and prevent anything. So these take it completely out of the hands of operators and out of valves failing in terms of emergencies and accidents. And then they're also designed to use more of the uranium inherent in the fuel. And the Wyoming reactor that I mentioned in particular is designed for a flexible output, so it can ramp up and down its power and have its own built-in storage to match any demand curves or ups and downs of renewable energy as well. And there's a lot of really promising work of how to use nuclear power to more cheaply produce carbon neutral liquid fuels as well. Because we'll need those for aviation, for like large construction equipment. There's always a last little segment that's hard to decarbonize, and so we'll need to find ways to produce fuels for those. So that's the end of my section, and I'll turn it over to Eric to finish this up. Thank you.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Yes, all right, rhetorical question. Thank you, Ethan, for going over the technology of nuclear fission. Nuclear fission is amazing. Obviously, the history begins with E equals mc squared and brought us where we are today with over 400 plants in over 30 countries. But all this kind of begs the question, why is this so important? To me, I'm very concerned with quality of life. Everybody wants a better life for themselves and their kids and generations going forward. This is a great vision. It's hard to evaluate that. And so economists have struggled, especially in the last couple decades, to accurately measure quality of life in something that goes beyond GDP per capita. So a lot of economists have looked at life expectancy or years of education or other metrics like the incidence of certain diseases like tuberculosis or cholera, this sort of thing. But something that they all kind of fluctuate towards is electricity usage, electricity consumption per capita. We all use more and more electricity as every generation progresses and the quality of life goes up. But in the current era, when we are struggling with issues of how to mitigate the effects of global warming and climate change and also reduce air pollution, there is a push for this electricity to be zero emission, emission-free, air pollution-free. But as a working definition for quality of life, we want to have longer lives with less pain and less work. And so as electricity use increases, human labor decreases. And overall, this is a good thing if one to have the option to do what you want to do with your life. Again, this is a kind of working model of international development, where you go from kind of a no electricity usage, but just basic water, food, clothing, shelter, to the area that we are in first world countries in the 21st century, where we have air conditioning and heating and Wi-Fi and chemotherapy and Netflix and everything else. And all of this uses a lot of electricity. So this is a map that is a good one to kind of qualify this idea of development. And so, we say, okay, which countries are rich? Which countries use a high quantity of electricity? We see in the West, we have Western Europe, we have North America, we have Australia, New Zealand. But then we also have a lot of the oil-rich places in the Middle East, and we have Asia, in particular Japan, South Korea, and now China. So we could say, okay, these are the places with a lot of economic development, a lot of capital. But, go to the next slide. If we look at air pollution, it's a slightly different story. Not all of the rich places are equally littered with air pollution. We see in the West, we have Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, not so much air pollution as opposed to the Middle East, Asia, Southeast Asia, North Africa. There's a lot more air pollution. So the question is, okay, why is this? And we think the question is obvious, that we have more electrification from zero emission sources. This is another map of one of the various quality of life indices. You can find these online, like the World Happiness Index. I think Finland is #1. I have a Finnish friend that always laughs at this and says, what are you talking about? But nonetheless, Finland's up there. We're up there, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. But I think it matches well with this ratio of electricity consumption and air pollution. So these are the top 20 countries of 2 of the major lists. The OECD put together one list, and then there's another one, Social Progress Index. You see, of course, the Nordic countries, a lot of Western Europe, you see Canada on there. And so with looking at these, we think, okay, well, what are some of the commonalities? And we have found, for the next slide, that about half of them get a significant portion of their electricity from nuclear power. And the ones that do not, several of them are oddly blessed with an oddly high supply of hydro geothermal power and an oddly low population. So when people say, oh, well, we can just copy Norway or Iceland or New Zealand, it's like, these are these tiny places, and just like 5 million people. We have a country of 330 million people and growing. So we need to think of something that is more scalable. Nuclear exists in over 30 countries. This map is actually kind of old. It's over 30 countries right now. The UAE, United Arab Emirates, has a plant as of a couple of years ago. And France is obviously the leader. We will keep on bringing up France all the time because that is the best model to work towards. They actually get a majority of their electricity from nuclear, and they have for decades. They kind of decarbonized without even trying in a very French kind of nonchalant way throughout the 80s. They just got rid of all of their carbon emissions from their electric grid. So we have to ask, what are the options for electricity? And I have found, and I suspect that you have probably also found in your efforts here, that people have a kind of oversimplified binary for energy policy and environmentalism. Okay, are you clean or are you dirty? And it's just this simple binary, and life is not simple. We live in a real world of gray. So, but to try to keep it simple, I would say that there are 3 options for electricity. Non-binary, 3 categories: fossil fuels, renewables, and nuclear. Fossils include coal, gas, and oil, and renewables, solar, wind, hydro, geothermal. So our efforts are to have people look at this 3rd category that's not easy to place one or the other. And just to let you know, I think some of the other presenters went over this, but we get about 20%, and unfortunately that is decreasing, of our electricity from nuclear power in the U.S. right now. But what that means is we still get a majority of our electricity from fossil fuels, in particular coal and gas. So if we want to get rid of these, we have to have a solution that actually works. So just in little chart form, fossil fuels are not purely bad. They have an advantage. They're reliable, efficient, and scalable, but as we know, they offer air pollution and carbon emissions. In contrast, we have renewables that are not so reliable, efficient, or scalable, but they have no air pollution or carbon emissions. So we think of nuclear as the best of all worlds. So with that in mind, you know, I think sometimes there is such a hysteria in some of these big polarized political issues that people just put the blinders on and just concentrate on what is their ideal, what is utopia, and they just want to concentrate on a goal rather than an actual solution of how to get there in the real world. So a better question is, would you rather, I don't know if you remember this game that you played when you were a kid, or would you rather be shot or stabbed, or would you rather be punched in the face, or would you rather be kicked, or this sort of thing. So, you know, nothing is perfect in the real world. The real world is full of trade-offs. You know, all of these energy sources require mineral extraction, they require carbon emissions. You know, what can we do? We're like vampires. This is how we go on living. Sorry. So, the problem again is not to simply reduce carbon emissions, but rather to reduce carbon emissions while continuing to increase quality of life for ourselves, our kids, our grandkids, etc. We cannot directly eliminate fossil fuels. We cannot directly eliminate solar and wind either. Instead, we must displace fossil fuels or displace anything else. If we want to displace fossil fuels with technology that works today, we must preserve and expand nuclear. We see this as really the only realistic solution to technology that works today. And I like to look at this graph. So the energy story of the last 20 years is coal use has gone down in the U.S. And, you know, overall this is very positive for air pollution and carbon emissions. But it was not done through a ban. It was not done through fiat. Rather, because of fracking, which is very controversial, because of the expansion of natural gas. Natural gas displaced coal in the market gradually, responsibly. So if people are opposed to gas, or if they're opposed to solar or wind or anything else, well, you need to think of an alternative to displace it with. And just to touch on the benefits of nuclear, which have already been talked about, the best thing is its reliability. It actually works. It's worked for over 60 years. It keeps the lights on, keeps you warm in the winter and cool in the summer, and it works all over the world. And we need something that is reliable. I think a big part of the problem of a lot of these political issues is not having a solid risk assessment. And there's so many problems, it's hard to digest, but I think that often the dangers of greenhouse gas emissions, although they are a little overstated, and the dangers of not having enough electricity are understated. We really need a lot of electricity, and this need is just growing. The other great thing about nuclear that's been mentioned is it's very, very low land use, low material use. So we have more opportunities for farmland, for nature, for wilderness, for wildlife. And this is really the original purpose of environmentalism early in America from, if you look at the figures like Teddy Roosevelt and the creation of the national park system. And jobs. Every politician loves to say clean jobs, clean jobs. This is what they think will get them elected. But when you put this under a microscope, a lot of the solar and wind jobs are on the lower skill side and on the more transient side. With nuclear, one thing that we've learned, and I'll share with you today, right now in New York State we have 3 operating plants on Lake Ontario, but until last year, on this day, April 30th, 2021, we had another one downstate, Indian Point. So this is the 1-year anniversary today, it just happened to be this day, when Indian Point shut down permanently. And we went there on the last day that it shut down. We went to this little town on the Hudson, Buchanan, this beautiful town with trees everywhere. And I mean, the town is not cheering for this, dirty power plant to be shutting down. They were very upset. The town offered these very long-term, often multi-generational jobs across a whole spectrum of blue-collar jobs and white-collar jobs. They gave charity, like parades and things to the small town. They provided an economic base. And the town might be really struggling from now on. There's so much worry about these little Rust Belt areas in the U.S. and power plants, especially zero air pollution emitting power plants, can really cure that. And yeah, to contrast with solar and wind, a lot of the supply chains, even if they are ultimately generating electricity in the U.S., most of the supply chains are overseas, in particular China. And this is obviously the geopolitically contentious region. We don't know if tariffs are going to go up. We don't know what happens if China invades Taiwan, just like Russia invaded Ukraine. It pays in the long term to have reliable energy domestically. And even though you could say that we're advocating for something that requires uranium mining, we have so much uranium already mined, and it takes so little to generate so much electricity. It's just not even close. Go on. And nuclear, compared to other utility energy industries, actually has the highest percentage of unionized workers and the highest median wages of any. And again, it really benefits the local communities. And so we really think, again, this kind of best of all worlds. It's good for workers, it's good for community, it's good for climate, it's good for nature, conservation. And the cost, this has been brought up before. I'm not an economist. But I'm always very skeptical of economic arguments because whenever somebody brings up, oh, this is too expensive, well, this could change over time, just as energy prices have been rising in the last few months, as you know. And that basically energy policy is so heavily influenced by subsidies and by regulations that if enough voters really want something and enough investors really want something, this will get cheaper over time. There's nothing cost prohibitive about building a power plant. If the demand is there, then the supply will be met. And just to illustrate our polarized moment, it seems like you mention any subject and people start screaming. Wouldn't it be great if there's something that we could agree on? And we really think that nuclear is this. Right now, the majority of Republicans in the U.S. and the majority of kind of right-wing parties in Europe are in favor of nuclear. And a kind of segment of the left has been more anti-nuclear, but they have been coming around recently. In particular, our current president, Joe Biden, has been pro-nuclear, and more importantly, his Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, is also pro-nuclear. And we suspect that as we see various degrees of failure with a rapid expansion of renewables, you will see politicians pivot, as they often do. And they will say, oh man, we're about to hit a ceiling. We need something that actually works. And that's what we're seeing in Europe right now. France has been a leader in nuclear power, but they honestly have the same kind of political battles that we have in the U.S. about nuclear power. So a lot of people there want to phase it out. And recently, with energy prices rising, and then with the rising very, very rapidly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, now, the recent election, Macron won. I mean, it was, a pro-nuclear Macron versus a pro-nuclear Le Pen. And we think that we'll see more and more of this shift where people on both sides of the aisle will see the value in nuclear, whether you care about just energy reliability and national security, or whether you have a laser focus on reducing carbon emissions. It makes sense either way. You don't need to argue about it. I would just say, for the purpose of this group, we are very concerned about the rapid expansion of solar and wind. I would like to give you the pro-nuclear argument as a tool in your toolbox. I think that it's hard to just be against something, because people will throw it in your face and say, hey, we have all these problems with carbon emissions and we need more electricity. What are you going to do? And so it's great to have a solution. And even if they talk about other technologies like carbon capture and sequestration, or hydrogen fuel cells that were talked about, desalinization plants, even with the rise of cryptocurrency, all of these new technologies require a huge amount of electricity, and if it comes from fossil fuels, then it's all for naught. It needs to be zero emission. And so nuclear power, you just pull that out, and yeah, we should look into expanding nuclear. Look into preserving the plants that we have upstate on Lake Ontario. Look to even adding reactors there, and look to adding advanced reactors in other parts of the state in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. This was excellent. We actually have our next speaker. He's going to be virtual. We're going to do that right here. We're planning on doing it up on the stage. So what I'd like to ask is if you guys could stick around, and if people have direct questions for you, they can come visit you at your at the table, or we can call you back later. There's
Sure.
A lot of interest.
We are chatty Cathy, so please chat us up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So give us 5 minutes. We're going to make the connection with Ben, and we'll probably unplug you guys here. So, and then we'll go ahead and have that. Okay.